Okay, so as Prof said, I'm also a postdoc in her group. I'm not a virologist, so my work mainly focuses on the ecology of bats, and I'm also very interested in the conservation of bats. So today I'm going to be telling you about how humans more impact bats, and let's get started. So in my talk, I would like to cover these 3 points of why, what, and how. So why is the environment and bat health linked? And I'll give you a perspective both from the human side, where we had a lot of introduction on that yesterday from Ava's talk specifically, but also then I would like to look at it from the bat perspective. So how are we as humans impacting bats and their health, and how is that related to human health? Next, what information do we currently have about the health of bats, specifically in Southern Africa? So just some broad information of what we know about bats in Southern Africa, and then what are the information gaps? Lastly, I would like to go through how to gather the relevant information that we need in studies on bats, very broad information, and then how we as a lab are currently using that information in some of our studies. So animal-human transmission, or spillover, is very broadly influenced by the landscape in which we find ourselves. And it's influenced both by what is happening in the environment, as well as the socio-economic pressures from humans. And this shift in land use changes the way that we interact with the environment and the way that we are exposed to animals in the environment. And things like land use change and changes in food systems and increasing human pressures are bringing us as humans into closer contact with wildlife that we usually wouldn't encounter. And this is obviously increasing the amount of spillover of zoonoses from wildlife. So there are various factors at play in the emergence of zoonotic diseases when land cover changes, mainly because it changes the environment of the host species. So in this case, we have a Rosetta's bat. So changes in land use changes the broad distribution of where these bats are found. It can also change the local abundance, so the amount of bats available or living in a certain area. It changes the seasonal infection dynamics within that population, and over the long term, it changes the population structure. So it can either increase or decrease your population in that area. So human infections or spillover zoonoses then occur to exposures to hazards, and this happens because there are biting arthropods and pest species circulating within your host population, and they spread the disease between the different pest animals. Human exposure then occurs through exposure to these different factors. So humans can either be bitten directly by your pest arthropods, or they're exposed to viruses through things like livestock that have come into contact with the hazard, or direct exposure to contaminated surfaces and food items. Your vulnerability to zoonoses is also related to the vulnerability of your human population, but the degree to which the hazard becomes a realized risk is affected mostly by your land use practices, your climate change, as well as your vulnerability of your population, which includes things like healthcare and access, your susceptibility, so people, their willingness to get vaccines, and as well as the food security and nutrition of your population. So this framework, I really like this framework. Everyone in my lab has seen this framework before. And it's quite similar to the Swiss cheese model that Ava showed us yesterday, in that it shows us all of the different factors that all work together to eventually lead to a case of your emerging infectious disease emergence. But I think it's a really nice model because it gives us a summary of the research focus areas that our group is specifically interested in, but anyone interested in studying all the different factors related to zoonoses and emerging disease emergence can use this as a framework where, it shows us the processes related in sustainable human development goals. It shows us the different trade-offs in the decisions that we take, where we can mitigate cases of disease emergence, and it aligns response options across all sectors. And I'm really focused on looking at various variables related to things that could lead to zoonoses emergence, and the data available and the data that we're interested in finding is in this tier called the proximate determinants. So those include both human and ecological variables that are involved in the whole process of EIDs. So these are also just some models showing the different approaches that we can take when we study EID emergence. So the first model is your total biodiversity model, where we assume that all taxa within the animal kingdom are equally likely to be sources of zoonotic outbreak. But the reason that this model is not very popular is it's a lot of work. So if you have to investigate all animals across all kingdoms because they might be likely to cause disease emergence, that's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of time. The second model is maybe a bit better because it's the zoonotic host diversity model, where it assumes that only specific animals within your greater biodiversity are likely to be sources of zoonotic disease outbreak. And that helps you to create a more focused surveillance program. And then the model that we mostly use is this model, where it's the zoonotic host diversity and abundance model. So we know that specific species within the greater biodiversity are likely models of zoonotic sources, and both their diversity and abundance can affect their ability to be transmission hosts. And of course, we're focused on bats. So I will now be talking about how we affect the bats rather than focusing on the zoonotic side of things. So bats play really important roles in the environment, where your fruit bats are involved in your pollination and seed dispersal, and your insectivorous bats are involved in pest insect suppression. So they eat your agricultural pests, your flies, so they're really important in managing pest populations. And in this process where they interact with the environment also affects them. So the environment can affect them in various ways, so both directly and indirectly, as well as have both short and long-term health implications for your bat species. So here I made a nice picture. I don't know why the white's coming up, but anyway, let's just ignore that. So here we have the bat environment, and here is the bat in its natural environment. That's a bit annoying. Anyway, so in the natural environment, the bat is using the natural landscape elements like the trees to navigate, and it's also, if it's a vegetation roosting species, it roosts in trees. I focus on the cave-dwelling species, so I like doing all of my research on them. So whenever I'm speaking about roosting habits or anything, I'm more referring to the cave-dwelling species and cave roosting rather than vegetation roosting. So this bat comes from a cave. He's flying around the landscape, he's feeding on insects, and then agricultural expansion comes along. So there's the farmer, and he has cleared a whole bunch of natural vegetation to plant his crops. And in this process, one of the main hazards that this bat is exposed to is pesticides. So pesticides is one of the emerging threats to bats throughout the world. In the process where the vegetation shifts to crops more than natural vegetation, you also change the food availability, because the insect types that now occur in this area are no longer the insects that used to occur because of the natural vegetation, but these are crop pests. So it causes a shift in the food availability to the bat. And these insects, they might eat these insects, or they might be unpalatable type insects that the bats don't want to feed on. Pesticides are also a problem because they are notoriously not species specific. So spraying pesticides does not only kill the insects that you focus on, it also contaminates your food sources and also water. So the bats might come into contact by directly feeding on the insects that have been treated with pesticides, or they might ingest the pesticides from drinking water that is in the area around your agricultural areas. And pesticides then get ingested, and they get stored in the fatty tissues of the bat. So they get stored in things like the liver, the brain, and the adipose tissue. And in the storage process, the pesticides can build up to a toxic level at some point, or they get metabolized during periods of stress. So things like when bats hibernate during winter, or when they migrate, they burn through their fatty tissues, and that then releases the chemicals into the bloodstream, leading to mortality. And the reason why this is a problem, so specifically in South Africa, we import and use 3,000 types of registered pesticide products within South Africa alone. So that makes the lack of pesticide studies, particularly in South Africa, but also across Southern Africa, quite a gap that we don't currently know what's happening. Next, we are on a quest for sustainable energy sources. So onshore wind energy is on the rise across the continent. So, for example, wind energy has increased 7-fold between 2009 and 2018, and that's mostly across Southern Africa because we have a lot of sustainable wind sources. And these wind energy facilities causes flight disruption in bats because they like using linear landscape features to navigate, and these things popping up in the middle of their flight path disrupts them. It also causes direct mortality where bats fly close to the blades and they don't actually always get hit by the blades, but the change in air pressure close to these windmills causes something similar to diver's disease, where it causes the bat's lungs to burst, so it causes instant mortality. The last thing is urbanization. So urbanization is also a major threat to bats because it also leads to habitat destruction. It also causes resource loss as their natural prey base decreases. Something else that is also a major problem is the production or the creation of major roads, as well as your electricity systems. And roadkill and electricity is also some of the major impacts on bats. Roadkill is quite understudied as well, and it's having a bigger impact than we are aware of. So you haven't heard of a lot of roadkill studies on bats. So all of these changes together can be labeled as land use change. And bat species can either adapt to these areas that have changed, or they can go and live somewhere else. We also have the direct human impacts where, for example, here we have the Rosetta's roosting in his cave, and we have people coming in persecuting the bats because they might perceive them as pests, or you have people actively hunting bats as a food source. You also have roost destruction where people come in and they mine for guano or they do mineral mining. Also have people that like just destroying things, so they might come into your cave roost and break things and create graffiti. And then obviously we as researchers also have impacts on these bats when we go into their caves and we sample them and we stick them with a bunch of things. But that just tells us why it is so important that we follow the PPE practices and the SOPs so that we are treating these bats that are already under pressure from all of these other aspects well. Because if we don't, it might lead to things like population decline and roost abandonment. So we have both direct and indirect impacts from humans that can have short and long-term bat health impacts, where your short-term impacts include things like immediate mortality, loss of body condition, and increases in parasite loads. You also have your long-term effects that might not be immediately apparent, which could lead to long-term population changes or declines. And the reason why bats might be, or some species of bats might be particularly susceptible to this, there are two factors. So one, it's the long generation length of bats. So bats, compared to something like rodents, have a very long population or generation lengths, which means that it takes a long time for individuals within the population to mature and reach a breeding stage. So if you look at rodents, it takes them 2.3 years on average to replace the number of breeding individuals in the population, whereas for bats it's more like 5.4 years. So that's quite a long time for a small-sized mammal. You also might have specific habitat dependency. So in the case of your cave-dwelling bats, they are reliant on caves for roosting and often on very specific caves. So your maternity caves are particularly important in this case. And if something happens to this cave, these bats, because they have a slow population turnover, they might not be able to adapt quickly enough in this changing environment. And that leads to extinction depth, which means that it might take you a long time to see the effects of the habitat changes happening at the moment. So what do we currently know about bats in southern Africa? Well, there's work from ARA, and we know that there are approximately 130 species of bats across South Africa, and this is constantly changing as new species are being described. So it's excluding the islands at this point. And this just highlights why our taxonomy and our conservation is so important, because if we don't know about species, and if a species is not classified, how can we study them and how can we conserve them? It's also quite interesting that this article was recently in the media where everyone thought that this bat species was extinct and they rediscovered it in a very small rainforested area. So that just, it really reiterates why it is important that we have taxonomy and classification of species in order to conserve them. We also know that the protection status of bats across southern Africa is pretty poor at this point. Particularly in South Africa, we don't have any legislation officially protecting bat species, and we also have an underrepresentation of species within the protected areas. So the majority of species records in southern Africa is located outside of a protected area. So that means we can't even assume that bats are protected by default just by being located within a protected area, if the majority of records are falling outside of protected areas. Another problem that we have is that conservation is very reliant on your IUCN global or your regional red list classification, because that determines the amount of conservation effort allocated towards a species. But when we have things like discrepancies between your global and your regional red list assessments, that creates confusion, and people aren't sure, are these bats protected? Are they classified as endangered? Are they classified as least concern? And a particular example is in Mauritius, these fruit bats, I think they're classified as vulnerable, but they're being culled at an alarming rate because people are perceiving them as agricultural pests. And that's from the government side, where they're not being adequately protected. So your IUCN classification is related to your conservation efforts. So things like discrepancies need to be sorted out in order for us to adequately protect our bat species. We also know that land use change is having, particularly in South Africa, a major impact on our cave systems, because our caves are also not located mainly in protected areas and are suffering land use changes. So the study that we did last year found that the majority of the tall trees around most of the roosts in our country are disappearing, and it's changing more to grassland and shrubby vegetation habitat types. And we also have your urbanization and your agricultural land uses increasing around these caves. And these caves are specifically caves where we know our Miniopterus and our Rosettus are occurring. So the fact that the bats are not protected and the caves are not protected are quite concerning. And I can show you a nice example actually of this change happening. So this is the Grootboom Cave, and it's one of the caves that we visit monthly to sample, and there's a population of Miniopterids living in this cave and one Rhinolophus that we sometimes catch. So this picture is from 2005, and you can see that there is some urbanization in the surrounding area, but mostly it's a natural landscape. Fast forward to 2021, we can see that this change has changed drastically. So we've had this very large urban estate popping up here. The cave is still over here, and there are no gates on this cave. There are no fences between the cave and the human population. So that means that anyone can come into the cave, do whatever they want. We've noticed an increase in dumping and rubble in this area. So people will just come and chuck their rubbish right next to the cave. There's also a guy living in the cave, so we find his food packets and his candles and things quite often when we go and sample. We haven't yet seen him, I think, but he's around, he's definitely around. So that just means that this population of bats living in this cave is exposed to all of the human effects, and they're not being protected from it at all. So this is also just work that we did that showed that the environments and the habitats where the caves are located are not protected. So this was using the South African National Biodiversity Institute's Ecosystem and Protection and Threat Levels map. So this is not related to the caves themselves, but rather the environments where the caves are located. And we can see that the majority of the caves are either located in environments that are poorly protected or not even at all protected, with a very small proportion of caves being located in environments where they are well protected. And just to show an example, so this is a publication by Ferreira et al. From 2020, where they went into the Wynberg cave system, which is also a known Rosettus roost, and they saw an increase in the graffiti in the cave, where people are going in and vandalizing the cave, and they also saw a very large increase in dead bats. And what is quite shocking about this is this cave is actually located in a protected area. So this means that even though caves might be by accident located in protected areas, it does not mean that caves or the bats inside the caves are receiving adequate conservation protection. So it's something that we are working towards, to include these types of things in policies and making people aware that we need specific conservation actions for these bats, both to protect their habitats, but also to protect the humans that are living in and around and near these roost sites. So we know that environment and human health is linked. We also want to understand how many people can be affected in the case if something happens, if a zoonotic spillover occurs. We also want to look at what things have been used elsewhere to mitigate these sorts of events. Cost is obviously very relevant. What are mitigation actions going to cost us, cost the government? But most importantly, what data are available for us to use in investigations where we can predict areas where we should do future monitoring and which could be hotspots for disease emergence. So I will take you through some of the publicly available data sets or where you can find data to help you conduct studies like these. So something exciting I recently came across is this website called DarkSide, where it is a database where they are storing key bat locations across the world. So a whole bunch of researchers across the world are putting their data into this database, and it's driven by Tinalgo and colleagues. And it is to facilitate better and more collaborative research across the world regarding bats and specifically cave-dwelling bats. However, when I took a look at their database, I can see that Africa is still pretty underrepresented. So here we have our database of cave locations throughout Africa, and this is their database. So we can see that they still have some gaps, and it's up to all of us here in the room to help facilitate and help build this database. So when I did my PhD, I did not have this convenient database where I could just log in and get a whole bunch of cave locations and start my research. So what I did is I went through published studies, museum annals, published scientific papers, to try and find information about what types of species these guys were looking at, and specifically where I could find cave locations. Because how can we create monitoring programs and know where to go if we don't know where the caves are located? So published studies were quite useful to me when I was doing my PhD. I've also found that tourism media like websites and flyers were also quite useful, because people would advertise caving tours and people would write blogs and have pictures about bats. So then you could actually go and see, oh, they saw Miniopterus type species in this cave. So that was also quite a powerful tool to use. And I found that often the caves mentioned in the tourism media pages were not in the published studies. So that way you could expand your database on specifically caves. Local knowledge is also important. So your religious groups and your hunters are quite good tools to use when you need to find bat locations. And in our discussion group yesterday, our colleague from Madagascar was actually talking about the hunters, that only they know where they can go and find the bats. The other people don't know. So the hunters would be good people to speak to when you are trying to find out more information about where you can go and sample your bats. So as long as you don't interfere with their practices and tell them you shouldn't be hunting bats too much, I think they would be quite willing to collaborate with you. Interest groups are also a very good source of information. So for example, here in South Africa, we have a very good caving association, and so you don't have to go and crawl around in the cave. These guys do it for fun, and they will tell you where these caves are located. They're also very perceptive, so they can tell you, oh, I noticed bats in this cave during this month, but other months they're not there. So they're quite good sources of information. And citizen scientists are also a very powerful tool to use. And that just makes the sharing of the research that we do so important, because if you can engage the citizens, they can actually be quite useful sources of information. So as an example, we published an article in The Conversation a couple of months ago, and I had someone emailing me saying, oh, he's from the Northern Cape, and he's noticed a decrease in fruit bats in his area because they always come and they eat the figs on his trees. And the reason that he knows that the population is decreased is because there's much less poop on his veranda than usual. So something like that. We didn't even know that there were fruit bats in these areas, and now we have a contact that we can reach out to perhaps do some future monitoring, which wouldn't have been possible if we didn't share our research with the broader community. So this data is also from ARA, so it's from the book. So this book is a very good tool to use to know where your bat species are throughout the country. So you can have things like your broad diversity and abundance of bats, but also you can look at specific bat species. So if you're only interested in your Rosetta's bat species, you can just extract their information and look at sites where you would possibly want to sample in future. So I'm sure if you speak to him, he would gladly assist you with collaborating on research. So we also have work done by Prof Markotter, where we can relate the distribution and abundance of the bat species with their viruses. Of course, because I'm interested in land use and land use change, you want to know what the landscape around your sites of interest looks like. And this is one of the best land use change maps available at the moment. It is free to download. You don't have to go and classify land use. So I'm not a GIS technician, so I have no idea how to classify one type of land use versus another. They've already done it for you. So this is free to download. It's easy to use. You don't have to pay anything. Something I also recently noticed is this land cover map, a predicted land cover map by 2050. So not only can you get information about what the land use currently looks like, they have created these models and maps that shows what the land use is going to look like in a bunch of years' time. And I think this is also a very nice data set to have if you're doing risk-based investigations. You also want to know what your human population densities are looking like in the area of interest. So WorldPop is one of the best open source available human population density data sets right now. And it is also freely available, and it is also country specific. So you can go and download specifically the human population density data for the area that you are interested in. Then you also have your policy, technology, and infrastructure data sets that you are interested in. So there are roads, electricity grid data sets, and also healthcare facility data sets, which I think is quite necessary to have when you're doing risk-based investigations, because you want to know how many and what types of healthcare facilities are in your area in the case that should something happen. Then livestock density data. So this, I see this is used quite often. So that is the gridded livestock of the world, and it's created by the Food and Agricultural Organization. And it is quite often used in studies, but whenever I see this data set, it just frustrates me, because it is more than 10 years old by now, and we don't have any comparable data set available to us, specifically in Southern Africa, or it's difficult to find, or it's just not available. And us as researchers here in Southern Africa need to think about ways of how can we get information like this so that we have more up-to-date information available to us when we are conducting studies like these. And an example that we could potentially use is something like your CO2 emissions per unit protein. So it's a satellite that they use to measure the amount of CO2 emissions, specifically made by livestock like cows. And it is something that we could potentially use as a proxy rather than using this very outdated land data set. So lastly, what we are working towards is creating hotspot maps specifically for Southern Africa. And I came across this paper by Kennedy et al., where they created a human modification index, and they created it for the whole world. And it's a nice model, because it doesn't only assume one specific human impact. So it is an additive model of various different human impacts like roads, electricity grids, land use change, agriculture, to give you areas where specifically your human impact is high. And then you can add in to this model things like your livestock density data and any other type of data that you want to use to quantify risk for disease emergence. And how this works is you have what is called a data independent analysis framework, which is just a very fancy word for a grid. And you can use this grid to identify areas within your study site, and it is then used to specify areas where your human modification is high. So the way that they calculate it is the footprint. So the footprint is the area of your grid, the area of your human impact times the total area of the grid cell. And because it's a grid, it gives you equal areas. So it's a nice standardized way of sampling your area. And then to quantify the impact of these different factors, you just times the footprint, which you've just calculated, by the impact factor. And Theobald has already given those impact factors for your different land use factors. And what it eventually will look like is something like this. Mine is still a work in progress because my calculations are not working out nicely right now, but it'll get there. And then we can use this to identify areas where you have high human modification. So the darker areas are highly modified areas versus lower modified areas in light gray. So we can then go and overlay our caves database information, our bat information, and see potential areas where we should be conducting future sampling and monitoring. So just to conclude my talk, I showed you how the environment affects bat health through both direct and indirect human impacts, all these impacts can broadly be classified as land use change. We know that bats and their habitats are currently underrepresented in conservation strategies, and there are various research avenues for us in Southern Africa that we can pursue. And where to gather information, so literature and other sources are great places to look for information, as well as citizens and publicly available data that are free for you to download that you can use in your future investigations. Thank you.